It's 1:15 in the afternoon on a warm Friday in Corona del Mar, California. An 11-year-old girl is walking alone down a quiet residential street. She's just left summer school. She's got a homemade book bag slung over one shoulder, and she's still upset. You can see it if you look closely. A few minutes earlier, she was crying. A van pulls up beside her. It's turquoise. The back door is already open. A man is standing next to it. Two people driving by notice the moment. A young woman named Jandy and her mother. They don't think much of it. Not yet. Just a man, a van, a girl on the sidewalk. They keep driving. They have no way of knowing they just witnessed the last confirmed sighting of Linda and O'Keefe. By the next morning, an architect out for a bike ride with his 4-year-old son will be searching a drainage ditch for frogs. He will find something small and pale and still. What happened to Linda in between those two moments would go unanswered for almost 50 years. 2 DNA tests. 1 failed database search. A police department that never took her photo off the wall. And a break that would come not from a confession, not from a witness, but from a stranger's decision to spit into a plastic tube for a genealogy website, decades later, with no idea what it would unlock. This is that story. Welcome to XTC Uncovered. If this is your first time here, don't forget to subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. We've got viewers on every continent, and we genuinely love seeing where this community stretches to. Now let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand how Linda O'Keefe's case finally broke open, you first need to understand who she was, and exactly how ordinary, how devastatingly ordinary, the day she disappeared really was. Linda and O'Keefe was the middle child in a family of 5, growing up in the small beach community of Corona del Mar, a neighborhood within Newport Beach, California. She was quiet, gentle, the kind of child people remembered as sensitive long after she was gone. She loved painting. She loved crafts. She played piano, and she took the lessons seriously. She was a Girl Scout, and she loved animals. She'd recently lost her cat, and by her mother's account, she took the loss hard, the kind of hard that shows just how deeply she felt things. Her father, Richard, worked as a machinist. He and Linda were close, the kind of closeness that comes from shared quiet time rather than big gestures. Her mother, Barbara, was an artist and a working seamstress, and she made many of her children's clothes herself, including the dress Linda wore on the last day anyone saw her alive, a white dress patterned with light blue flowers and trimmed in dark blue. Her older sister, Cindy, would later describe Linda as a gentle, lovely soul, someone who always seemed to see the good in people, even when the world around her didn't always deserve it. On the morning of July 6, 1973, Linda got ready for another day of summer school. She normally rode her bicycle to Lincoln Intermediate School, just a short trip through the neighborhood streets of Corona del Mar. But that morning, her routine changed. Her piano teacher offered her a ride, and Linda took it. It seemed like a small, unremarkable shift. In hindsight, it would turn out to matter more than anyone could have imagined, because it meant that when the school day ended, Linda didn't have her bike. She had no way to get home except to walk or to be picked up. So she did what any 11-year-old would do. She went to the school office, and she called her mother. Barbara picked up. She was busy, caught up in the demands of the day, the kind of ordinary busyness that never feels significant until later, when it's the last decision replayed 1,000 times. She told Linda she couldn't come get her. She told her to walk home instead. It wasn't a cruel decision. It wasn't even an unusual one. Kids walked home from school every day in 1973, in a quiet beach town where nothing like this had ever happened. But Linda didn't take it well. She was upset. She hung up the phone, and instead of leaving right away, she sat down on the curb outside the school office. She sat there for a while, crying, working through the disappointment the way kids do, alone, in that small private grief that adults rarely see. Eventually, she stood up, and she started walking. The route home would have taken her through familiar streets, sidewalks she'd walked 100 times, past houses she recognized, in a town small enough that most people knew their neighbors by name. Corona del Mar, in 1973, was the kind of place where a child walking home alone raised no alarm at all. It was safe, or at least, it was assumed to be. At around 1:15 in the afternoon, less than an hour after that phone call, Linda reached the intersection of Marguerite Avenue and Inlet Drive. That's where Jandy and her mother saw her. That's where the turquoise van was parked. That's where a man stood beside it, the back door open, close enough to Linda that the 2 witnesses driving past would remember the scene clearly enough to describe it to investigators decades later. The color of the van, the position of the man, the fact that the door was already open, as if it had been open and waiting. Neither Jandy nor her mother stopped. There was nothing that looked like a struggle, nothing that looked like danger. Just a girl, a van, a man, a moment that could have been anything. A moment that, to two strangers passing by in a car, didn't seem worth a second glance. It would be the last time Linda and O'Keefe was ever seen alive. Hours passed. Somewhere in Corona del Mar, evening set in the way it does on a July day near the coast. Long light, cooling air, the ordinary rhythm of a neighborhood winding down. But Linda didn't come home. And as the hours stretched past what should have been a short walk, worry in the O'Keefe household turned into something sharper. At 6:42 that evening, a call came into the Newport Beach Police Department from a house on Orchid Avenue. Linda and O'Keefe was missing. What followed was not the delayed, uncertain response that so many cold cases begin with. This community moved fast. Officers fanned out almost immediately. They searched the vacant fields south of Pacific View and east of Marguerite, open lots that, in 1973, still dotted that part of Newport Beach before later development filled them in. They searched the reservoir. They walked the neighborhood streets, checked yards, checked the places an 11-year-old girl might have wandered off to on her own. Patrol cars combed the roads. As night fell and the search widened, officers moved into Fashion Island and toward the edges of the Back Bay, first on foot, then by car, then, as the search intensified, by helicopter, sweeping light across terrain that patrol cars simply couldn't reach. Jeeps pushed into the rougher areas along the water where regular vehicles couldn't follow. They searched through the entire night, and they found nothing. Somewhere out there, in the dark, along a stretch of nature trail most of Corona del Mar barely thought about, something had already happened that no searchlight was going to undo. But nobody searching that night knew that yet. All they had was a missing 11-year-old girl, a community that had never faced anything like this before, and a search that would carry on past midnight and into the early hours of the next morning, with no answers in sight. By the time the sun came up over Newport Beach on July 7th, Linda O'Keefe had been missing for almost 12 hours. What happened next? What a local architect would find while riding his bike with his young son that morning, and everything the investigation would uncover in the decades that followed. That's where we pick up next. Before we go any further, if you want to see exactly how a single moment like this one, caught by two strangers driving past in a car, ends up cracking a case wide open nearly 50 years later, hit subscribe right now. This channel exists for cases exactly like Linda's, and there's a lot more of her story still to tell. Deliberated narrative structure and chapter continuity strategy. Deliberated narrative structure and chapter continuity strategy. Cold Case Corona del Mar. Chapter 3, Linda's story. For most of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, Linda O'Keefe's case existed in a kind of suspended state. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but frozen. Investigators had evidence. They had a physical description from witnesses. They had the account of a turquoise van and a man standing beside it at the corner of Marguerite and Inlet. What they didn't have was a way to turn any of it into a name. That began to change, slowly, in the late 1990s, when a criminalist working the case took swabs preserved from the original investigation and ran the first DNA test the technology of the era allowed. It produced something significant, an unknown male genetic profile, pulled directly from evidence connected to Linda's murder. For the first time since 1973, investigators had something concrete tying a specific, individual human being to the crime. They just didn't know who he was. In 2001, that profile was entered into CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database, the system law enforcement agencies across the country used to check unknown crime scene DNA against the profiles of convicted offenders already on file. It was, at the time, the best tool available for closing exactly this kind of gap. Investigators ran the search, and they waited. There was no match. Whoever had left that DNA behind in 1973 had never been arrested for a crime serious enough to land his profile in the system. He wasn't in CODIS. He wasn't going to be found that way. And so, once again, the case settled back into silence. Not because anyone had stopped caring, but because the technology of the moment had reached its limit. That limit wouldn't hold forever. By the mid-2010s, forensic science had moved into territory that would have sounded like science fiction to the detectives working Linda's case in 1973. A field called forensic genetic genealogy was beginning to take shape. The idea that you could take an unknown suspect's DNA, not just check it against a database of criminals, But compare it against the millions of ordinary people who had voluntarily submitted their own DNA to consumer genealogy websites, hoping to learn about their ancestry, build out a family tree, or connect with long-lost relatives. None of those people were criminals. None of them had any idea their spit-in-a-tube ancestry kit might one day help solve someone else's murder. But the science didn't need the suspect himself in the system. It just needed a distant cousin. In October of 2017, Newport Beach Sergeant Court Deepweg made a decision that would ultimately reopen the entire case. He brought in a company called Parabon Nanolabs and asked them to do something with the DNA evidence that had sat, unmatched, since 2001. Parabon specialized in a technique called DNA phenotyping, essentially reading physical traits directly out of genetic material. Not just identity, appearance, ancestry, skin tone, eye color, hair color, the presence or absence of freckles. From decades-old evidence, Parabon built something investigators had never had before in this case, an actual face. A composite image of what their unknown suspect likely looked like. A Caucasian male, built entirely from the genetic fingerprint he'd left behind in 1973. It was a breakthrough, but a composite image alone doesn't solve a case. It gives investigators a face to look for. It doesn't give them a name. Around the same time, something else was quietly happening, separate from the lab work, separate from the department entirely. One of Linda's former classmates came across a Facebook post about a different cold case, a different family, a different decades-old tragedy that had recently been solved using this same kind of DNA technology. Reading it, something clicked. If a case like that could be solved after all these years, why not Linda's? That single Facebook post set off a chain reaction. Former classmates who had grown up, moved on with their lives, built careers and families of their own. Women like Terry Briscoe Corwin and Lisa Christopher, who had once been 11-year-old girls riding their bikes around the neighborhood in the desperate days after Linda's murder, found each other again. They formed a Facebook group. They called it Justice for Linda and O'Keefe. And they didn't just post about it online. They showed up, in person, at the Newport Beach Police Department, walking up to the counter and telling the officer on duty that they wanted to talk about a case from 1973. They had no idea, walking in, that they didn't need to convince anyone the case still mattered. Linda's photograph had been on the wall inside that department the entire time. The classmates who thought they were the ones keeping her memory alive discovered that the department had never let it go either. Two separate efforts, one from the people who loved her, one from the officers who'd inherited her case, had been running in parallel for years, neither fully aware of how far the other had come. That convergence gave Sergeant Deepweg and the department spokesperson, Jennifer Manzella, an idea. The Parabon composite existed. The public hadn't seen it yet. On July 6, 2018, the 45th anniversary of Linda's disappearance was approaching. Manzella had seen another agency, in Canada, try something unconventional on a cold case anniversary, telling the victim's story in the first person, in real time, through social media. She thought Newport Beach could do the same thing for Linda. What they built was called Linda's Story, told across 68 tweets over the course of the anniversary, written entirely from Linda's own point of view. It opened simply, "Hi, I'm Linda O'Keefe, or Linda and O'Keefe, if I'm in trouble with my mom. 45 years ago today, I disappeared from Newport Beach. I was murdered, and my body was found in the back bay. My killer was never found. Today, I'm going to tell you my story." From there, the thread walked through the events of July 6, 1973, almost exactly as they happened, time to the hour. The phone call to her mother. The walk home. The turquoise van at Marguerite and Inlet. The 6:42 p.m. call from Orchid Avenue, reporting her missing. The overnight search through the fields and the reservoir and the back bay. And finally, the tweet describing what Ron Yeo saw that next morning along Back Bay Drive. A man looking in the ditch on the east side of the road, searching for frogs in the cattails, instead finding something small and pale. It was an unusual, almost uncomfortable way for a police department to communicate. And it worked, in a way almost nobody expected. The thread reached across the entire world. By the department's own count, it generated roughly 7 million impressions, shared and read not just across the United States, but in South America, across Europe, in Australia, and France. For a moment, an 11-year-old girl's murder from 1973 was being discussed by strangers on every continent. At the very end of the thread, Newport Beach Police released the Parabon composite publicly for the first time. A face, built from DNA, shown to millions of people who had never heard Linda's name before that week. And alongside it, a question the department had been asking internally for months, now asked of the entire internet. What is his name? The Twitter campaign didn't produce an immediate arrest. No single tip led directly to a name in the days that followed. But it did something almost as important. It kept the case alive in the public consciousness at a moment when the science was finally catching up to what investigators needed. It kept pressure on. It kept Linda's story circulating at exactly the moment when a very different kind of breakthrough was quietly taking shape behind the scenes. Because while the public had been introduced to a composite face, investigators working with genetic genealogist C.C. Moore, still with Parabon, were taking the original DNA profile and running it against the same kind of consumer genealogy databases that ordinary people use to build family trees. They weren't looking for the suspect directly. They were looking for his relatives, distant cousins who had no connection to the crime at all, who had simply spit into a tube one day out of curiosity about where their family came from. In January of 2019, that search returned something. Not the suspect's own profile in a database. A genetic connection. A pointer built from partial matches to people who shared his DNA without ever knowing why it mattered. For investigators who had waited 18 years since the failed Cody's search and 46 years since Linda's murder, it was the first real thread leading toward an actual name. They pulled on it. And for the first time since July of 1973, it didn't lead nowhere. This is genuinely one of the things I love most about true crime cases like this one. It wasn't just the police who kept Linda's case alive. It was her own classmates, refusing to let her be forgotten, walking into a police station decades later to ask questions nobody else was asking. If that kind of persistence means something to you too, hit subscribe. It tells me to keep finding and telling stories like hers. And if you're still with me at this point, drop a comment with one word, justice. I read every single one of them. What that DNA lead uncovered, and the man it finally led investigators to, is where we go next. Parse and analyze this story. Start with the media res. I want the hook to leave viewers in suspense. The target is to keep them watching as they want to know more about the case. So they try to watch the other part of the case. After the suspense, tell them welcome to XTC Uncovered. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. With the new outline for the 4-chapter above, I want you to continue with the sequence of the story above, factoring every detail of a great true crime story into it. 2. Write in details on the next chapter. 3. Remove all bolded and clickable links. Text. 4. I want only the narrator's voice. 5. Allow it to be long without overlapping information from previous or future chapters. So start with chapter 4 and note that your results should here not PDF file, and it should be easy for copy and paste. The max word should be 2,000 word max for the chapter 4. Cold Case Corona Del Mar. Chapter 4. James Allen Neal. The DNA lead investigators pulled in January of 2019 didn't hand them a name outright. It handed them a family tree, distant relatives, genetic fragments, a web of connections that had to be worked backward, generation by generation, the same painstaking process genealogists had used to crack other cold cases in the years before. But this time, the tree eventually narrowed down to a single branch, and at the end of that branch was a man living quietly in Colorado Springs, Colorado, going by the name James Allen Neal. He was 72 years old. He had spent decades building a life far from Newport Beach, far from the case that had never stopped being investigated in his absence. What investigators discovered as they dug deeper was that the man now known as James Allen Neal hadn't always gone by that name. In 1973, at the time Linda O'Keefe was murdered, he was living under a different identity entirely, James Allen George Layton. At some point after the murder, he left California, relocated to Florida, and legally changed his name. He rebuilt himself, in effect, as someone else, a new name, a new state, a new life laid down on top of whatever had happened in Corona Del Mar in July of 1973. A genetic pointer was enough to bring investigators to his door, but it wasn't enough, on its own, to make an arrest. Detectives needed to directly confirm that Neal's own DNA matched the profile taken from the crime scene decades earlier. So they watched him. They waited for an opportunity to legally obtain a sample of his DNA without alerting him to what was happening. A discreet, careful process that authorities have never fully detailed publicly, only confirming that it worked. It did. The DNA recovered from Neal matched the profile that had sat unmatched in evidence since the 1990s, unmatched in Cody's since 2001, and unidentified through nearly 46 years of investigation. On the morning of February 19, 2019, at around 6:30, law enforcement arrested James Allen Neal in Colorado Springs. The following day, February 20th, Newport Beach Police Chief John Lewis and Orange County District Attorney Todd Spitzer stood together at a press conference in Santa Ana to announce what investigators had spent nearly half a century working toward. A suspect, a name, a face that matched not just the Parabon composite the public had seen the year before, but the actual man responsible. Spitzer didn't mince words about what the case had taken to get to this point. The pursuit of justice, he said, is never-ending. And in this case, the hunt for a child rapist and murderer had lasted more than 46 years, spanning generations of law enforcement officers who had inherited Linda's case file, inherited her photograph on the department wall, and carried the responsibility forward without ever seeing it resolved. Neal was extradited from Colorado to Southern California in the days following his arrest and booked into custody in Orange County. His first court appearance took place in a jail courtroom in Santa Ana, where his arraignment was postponed to March 29, 1973. March 29, 2019, giving both sides time to prepare for what prosecutors were now formally charging him with. The charges were severe. Murder, with a special circumstance allegation tied to the commission of lewd acts on a child under the age of 14. 5 separate felony counts of lewd or lascivious acts on a child under 14. And a sentencing enhancement allegation reflecting multiple victims, because Neal, it turned out, was not a one-time offender who had simply never been caught. If convicted on all charges, he faced a maximum sentence of 82 years to life in prison. Spitzer's office initially looked into whether the death penalty was legally available in this case. Ultimately, prosecutors determined it was not. That phrase, multiple victims, was not a formality in the charging documents. It was the direct result of what investigators uncovered once they identified Neal as their suspect. Tracing his history after 1973 led detectives to 2 other cases, this time in Riverside County, involving 2 young girls who had been sexually assaulted sometime between the 1990s and the early 2000s. These were not cases that had gone completely undetected. They existed in some form in the record, but it was the identification of Neal in the O'Keefe case that allowed investigators to connect him directly to those assaults as well. A man who had evaded justice for Linda's murder in 1973 had, in the decades that followed, gone on to harm at least 2 more children before finally being stopped. For Linda's family, for her parents, for her sister Cindy, for the friends who had spent their own childhoods riding bikes around the neighborhood trying to help find her killer, for the classmates who decades later walked into a police station and asked someone to finally listen. The arrest was the moment they had waited almost their entire lives for. 46 years is not an abstract number. It's a childhood, an adulthood, an entire life lived alongside an unanswered question. And now, finally, there was a name attached to it. A face. A man in custody, awaiting trial, facing the consequences of what he'd done. But this story does not end with a courtroom, and it does not end with a verdict. Neal remained in custody at the Theo Lacey facility in Orange, California, as the case moved through the pretrial process. Depositions, motions, all the slow procedural machinery that stands between an arrest and an actual trial. That process takes time under the best of circumstances. Neal was 73 years old. On May 25, 2020, Neal was taken from Theo Lacey to a nearby hospital, suffering from an undisclosed illness. Officials were careful to clarify, at the height of a global pandemic when every hospitalization drew immediate suspicion, that his condition was not related to COVID-19. Whatever was affecting him, it was serious enough to require hospital care, and serious enough that it would not be something he recovered from. On July 22, 2020, at approximately 5:15 in the morning, James Allen Neal died in custody. He never stood trial. He never had to answer, in a courtroom, in front of Linda's family, for what he did to her in 1973, or for what he did to 2 more children in the years that followed. The case that had taken 46 years to identify him ended, in the final measure, without the one thing everyone involved had spent decades working toward: a verdict, spoken out loud, in a room where Linda's family could hear it. District Attorney Todd Spitzer addressed the death directly, and he didn't soften what it meant. The pursuit of justice, he said again, is never-ending. And in this case, the hunt for a child rapist and murderer lasted more than 46 years and transcended generations of law enforcement officers. Neal's death before trial, he said, robbed the O'Keefe family of the justice they so deeply deserved, and it deprived every officer who had ever worked this case of the satisfaction of finally seeing it through to the end. Newport Beach Police Chief John Lewis echoed the same sentiment, saying it had been the department's full intention to see James Allen Neal stand trial and answer in open court for the murder of Linda and O'Keefe. He never did. What Linda's case ultimately left behind isn't a tidy resolution. It's something more complicated than that. It's confirmation, finally, after 46 years, of who took her life. It's accountability, in the sense that his identity is now permanently, publicly attached to what he did and can never again hide behind a changed name in a different state. It's the two additional victims in Riverside County who, because of this investigation, saw their own cases connected to the man responsible decades after their own assaults. And it's a reminder, both devastating and important, of exactly how far modern science has come since 1973, how a piece of preserved evidence, sitting untouched through failed database searches and shifting technology for nearly half a century, could still, eventually, tell investigators exactly who they were looking for. Linda Ann O'Keefe was 11 years old. She loved painting and piano and the beach, and she saw the good in people, even in a world that, for her, turned out to hold something unspeakably cruel. Her case took 46 years to solve, and even then, the ending isn't the one anyone wanted. But her name is known. Her story was told, not by strangers speculating about what might have happened, but in her own voice, reaching millions of people who never knew her, and who will not forget her now. If this case affected you the way it affected us researching it, this is exactly the moment to hit subscribe, because we cover cases like Linda's every single week, and every one of them deserves to be remembered the same way. If you want to see more cold cases finally get the resolution, or in some cases, the complicated, incomplete resolution that Linda's did, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. And before you go, share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Cases like Linda's stay solved because people keep talking about them. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.